Good afternoon and welcome to Conversations with Father Bosco, a webinar series hosted by the Office of Mission and Ministry and the Georgetown University Alumni Association. Thank you for taking time out of your day to connect virtually with fellow Hoyas for today's conversation, the Global Jesuit Community with Father Matthew Carnes. Our host, Father Mark Bosco, is Vice President for Mission and Ministry at Georgetown University and holds an appointment in the Department of English. A native of St. Louis, Missouri, Father Bosco joined Georgetown after 14 years at Loyola University Chicago, where he was a tenured faculty member with a joint appointment in the Departments of Theology and English. From 2012 through 2017, he also served as director of the Joan and Bill Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage at Loyola. As a scholar, Father Bosco has focused much of his work on the intersection of theology and art, specifically the British American Catholic literary tradition. He has published on a number of authors, including the writers Graham Greene and Flannery O'Connor, and the theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar. He is also co-producer and co-director of the film Flannery, which was awarded an NEH grant. I'm Kelly Young, Associate Director of Strategic Engagement and Alumni Relations, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to share a few tips and reminders. This conversation is being recorded. The recording will be made available on our YouTube channel, and you will receive the recording link in a follow-up email. Father Bosco and Father Carnes will answer audience questions towards the end of their discussion. Please send in your questions using the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel. If you're having any technical difficulties or other issues, please also submit those concerns to me via the questions section of that control panel. Without any further ado, I'm pleased to turn things over to Father Mark Bosco.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everyone to Conversations here. We got Father Matthew Carnes with us today. Father Matt is Associate Professor at the Department of Government and Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. He has been a fellow at the Hoover Institute in Stanford University, where he did his Ph.D. in political science. He has a book that was published in 2014 by Stanford called Continuity Despite Change, The Politics of Labor Regulation in Latin America. And he's done a lot of articles and book chapters on Latin America and different places, especially. He's taught in Latin America. He's definitely one of our most internationally known Jesuits here, especially bringing kind of a sense of urgency about what's going on both in the world in terms of economic justice, but also really has met a lot of Jesuits around the world. And so as you saw, we're calling this the theme of this is really about the international quality of our Jesuit community, but also how that is lived and embodied and nurtured here at Georgetown. So Matt, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's great to be with you. And I've watched a couple of these before, and they've been fun. So hopefully I can follow in the footsteps of Father Hentz and Father O'Malley.
Very good. Very good. We were talking just before we started. We met, I think, probably in the late 90s in San Francisco. When I was working at St. Agnes Church in the Haight-Ashbury, so many Jesuits have gone through that. But you're originally from California, right? And can you tell us a little bit about, your vocation that got you to join the Society of Jesus? I think you were already a Stanford undergrad when you were discerning. And what led you to the kind of work you're doing at the School of Foreign Service?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's fun to look back on that time. It seems a long time ago now. I think we're getting up there a little bit since that time, almost 30 years. I first met the society there at Stanford. You're right. So, it came down to undergrad choices for me. Maybe I made the wrong choice. It was either going to be Georgetown or near home, Stanford. And I stuck around near home and went to the school up the street, which was Stanford. And we had just one Jesuit there, a Jesuit that actually both of us have known, a man named Russ Rohde, who was the campus minister and was someone who gave a real meaningful connection between the academic life and an applied life of meaning, just in the way he preached and the way he carried himself. And I remember being very impressed with him. I didn't know him initially. In fact, my best friend knew him much better because he had gone to a Jesuit high school, so he had a natural connection. But through my friend, I got to know Father Russ, and eventually made a version of the spiritual exercises with him, a directed retreat where he helped me reflect on my life and my values and what mattered to me. And during that process, I was asking, like, what would a life of meaning look like? Like, what would it make sense to do after graduating from college? And a few things stood out for me. As I prayed and as I learned to pray, actually, which is something I hadn't done before, I started to realize that, well, a life based in a relationship with God had a lot of meaning. I'd hardly opened the scriptures before, but as I started praying with the scriptures, I kind of fell in love with the God I found there, the Jesus I found there. I had already worked some in Latin America, and another value that came up in that time of discernment was this connection with people cross-culturally, and especially those who were working for justice in their home settings. Another really important value for me was community, and like being with people I could love and feel like I had a connection to. And finally, the intellectual life was something that I knew I really, really deeply needed in my life. And I remember there was this one day, I was early in senior year, and I said to myself, who has these things, like this relationship to God, community, this sense of crossing cultures and working for justice, this sense of the intellectual life? I was like, oh my gosh, Russ has got that. This Jesuit has that. And so I went to him, I said, I think I should be a Jesuit. I'll never forget it, because he looked at me, he said, that's wonderful. He said, but how many Jesuits do you know? And I said, well, I know one. And he said, well, you're not entering for a while. You got to meet some more Jesuits. So he actually sent me to Berkeley, where you were studying at the time. We didn't cross paths, but and it was through getting to know some of those guys and spending some more time that I eventually ended up entering the Society of Jesus. We can talk about some of the intervening steps as we keep talking, but I'll just flash forward and say that connection to a global interest in justice and connection to Latin America was something that persisted throughout my Jesuit life. It led me repeatedly back to the region. And ultimately, and we can talk more about this, got me to end up here at Georgetown many years later, now making the right choice, where I made the wrong choice before, making the right choice now to be in the right place.
Well, we got you as a Hoya one way or the other, so we're very pleased by that. So that's good. It's funny, Matt, I've known you now for a while, and I hear some of the students talking, especially now I live in the dorm, and many of them are taking your classes, and I overheard a student say, "Oh, you got to take Carnes, you got to take Carnes." So I think you're well loved by the students here. They consider you a great teacher. What courses do you teach, and what's your favorite course to teach Hoyas here at Georgetown?
Yeah, I love teaching in general, but the things I love to teach, I'm going to talk about maybe two, if you don't mind. So one is, I get to teach our intro course to comparative politics, which is kind of politics around the world. And for many students, it's the first time they've ever thought deeply about, oh, governments can work different ways. There's always this sense of like, oh, it must be the way we do things here in the United States or wherever they're from for that matter. And when they start to open up their minds and say, wait a second, they do it that way in France, or Mexico, has created identity this way, or wow, that's an issue in South Africa that I hadn't, realized is a similar one to what we have here, where economic systems can be organized in different ways. Oh, it's just marvelous. So I love to teach that class.
It's your large class, right?
Okay, so that's 250 students.
Yeah,
so
wow.
Who knows how we're going to do it this coming fall, but we've done it in big lecture halls. And I love to be connected to the students. So I actually walk up and down the main aisle. So I'm never too far from the students. We use clickers, so they're constantly kind of interacting with me as I'm asking questions throughout. So I love kind of the give and take and the dialogue of it. I often say it's kind of, if I do it right, it's kind of a gateway drug, because it gets them kind of hooked on wanting to know more about politics around the world and wanting to engage it. And I craft the class very clearly around what I talk about, sort of an arc that leads us from both understanding the world to thinking about what's my place in the world to like, how should I make a difference in the world? And it's really carefully kind of constructed that way, so that they often, especially love the last lecture, because in a way, all the little threads I've been dropping throughout, kind of come to fruition. And there's this way where like, wow, now we feel kind of ready and empowered to, as I often remind them, to go out, right? So like John Carroll is there at the gates, not to like keep you here. He's there looking out because your goal is to go out into the world. And so let's create a class where we get to think about this, but then see where we can plug into the world. So I love that, but I just do want to very briefly say, I also love teaching small classes, so when you can have 8 or 10 students in a circle where it's not so much me talking, but it's them talking, and I can listen in and occasionally ask a question that maybe, pushes us in a direction a little bit, but Georgetown students are so smart. and they're really, really deeply reflective. And they have a passion to want to do something meaningful with their lives. This last semester, in the last couple of years, I've gotten to teach what they call a bridge course, which is kind of a short course for seniors. Each year I've had like 10 or 11 students. And we kind of asked that question from the first class, but more personally, what's my place in the world? Like, what am I going to be committed to? How will I be, I kind of say, how will I be a citizen in the world when I go forth?
Yeah.
And to see the ways they grapple with that and struggle with that, but also really find passion and excitement in that. Oh, it's marvelous. I love teaching that as well. In fact, some days, many days, even more so.
That's great. Yeah, our students, I like to say they're wicked smart. They're just, they really are amazing. You do a lot of intellectual work, teaching, professional work like that, but you've really been really helpful with the Spanish speaking mass here. So it's, we have to remember Georgetown's a very international place. Lots of people from Mexico, Latin America, Spain, and you preside at the Sunday monthly Spanish Mass. Can you tell us about the Spanish community and how it's growing here, Spanish speaking, I should say, and why this Mass is so important?
Yeah, no, the Mass is so important. It's kind of a glue and a touchstone for so many students. There's a way where speaking of God in the language you first learned, or in the language that you heard especially from your parents or grandparents, it just hits a core for people. I mean, it really does. And there are a number of students that actually have grown up in families that speak more English than Spanish. They're Latinx. They're here in the United States, born in the United States.
Right.
But God's been talked about in Spanish, and there's a way where that somehow really deeply resonates with them. And one thing that's been amazing is, so I've been at Georgetown now 11 years. To see the growth in the Latinx community, the Latin American community over those years. So my first couple years here, I was fortunate. A few people ahead of me had actually started some of the things like Despedida, or the welcome for our Latinx students at the beginning of the year, the leadership dinner. Mm-hmm. And those were small events. Like the Despedida, I remember a couple years where we had 20 people, 30 people. Now, right, that fills the ICC auditorium. I mean, we can't pack everybody in because there's so many. And so many of them that are so involved too in the Spanish Mass community. And in the last year, we've seen that grow up even more dramatically. And, it's partly, we have great student leaders. So Cynthia Garcia, you may know, is just a marvelous student who reaches so many students. Yeah. But then Carmen Fitzsimmons in the mission and ministry team has been so good at kind of reaching out and really making this something very accessible and attractive to students. And again, I think it resonates so much, but it really does give people a sense of belonging and yeah, identity. And so I feel just so blessed to get to say that Mass and be with them.
I love to come through during the fiesta time afterwards, where they have food of all the different kinds of Spanish and Latin American delicacies. It's a lot of fun. As we know, bring food and students will come, and they'll come even more. So it's a wonderful kind of two tables of conversation, faith and social. That's great. Well, let's kind of move into this idea of the international. When I joined the Society of Jesus, a good friend of mine said, "Oh, you're joining the global division of the priesthood," and I know he's being kind of facetious in some ways, but it's true. I mean, in some ways, we are an international body, right? And one of the things that you embody particularly well in your own formation as a Jesuit is this kind of global reach, the global concerns. Can you speak a bit about your formation and the ways that it deepened your desire to work and do scholarship and international studies? And because I think in many ways you were actually placed in a lot of international places for your formation. Am I right?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Well, I came in and I was fortunate from the beginning in that I already had Spanish. I already could speak Spanish fairly well. I'd studied abroad in Chile. And I'd worked some in Paraguay and in Ecuador in high school. So, my college and high school gave me some experience of Latin America. So when I entered as a novice, they said, well, everybody should know a second language. And as you know, in the Society of Jesus, if English is not your first language, it's your second language. So everybody else in the world has to learn it. If English is your first language, your second language is Spanish. So all the novices had to go off and learn Spanish. And often that meant they stayed in the novitiate, or they, occasionally, some summers would go to Mexico or something. But since I already knew Spanish, I was able to just go into the field and do work. So as a novice, I worked with Franciscans doing in like a soup kitchen in northern Mexico. In in Regency, I went multiple times to Uruguay, which my province of California had a link with. And I worked in a retreat house some, I worked at a high school some. I helped lead some sort of like summer retreats. Actually, there were winter retreats there, way up in the north of Uruguay. And then eventually, I did my final formation as a Jesuit in Chile in my tertianship. But probably the most formative experience of all of it was in the middle of my formation, so what we call Regency. So our, it's often when we go out and do some practical work, we teach in a high school or something. So I was teaching in our high school in San Jose, California, when a hurricane hit Central America, Hurricane Mitch. This was the end of 1998.
Right.
And it was the biggest hurricane that hit Central America in decades. I mean, they said there were 11,000 people that died in Honduras. They said that there were 50 years of development disappeared in 5 days. Bridges washed out, buildings washed out, lives lost, livestock lost, all these things. And I saw a little note go up in our Jesuit community saying they needed help from the superior there in Honduras, saying we need help. And so I went to my superiors and said, could I maybe lend a hand there? I know some Spanish, I'm still fairly young, could I lend a hand? And that began a really interesting discernment, but within a few months, there I found myself in Honduras for a year, working alongside other young Jesuits who had the same sort of desires like me. So we had another guy from Mexico that I'd actually met as a novice very briefly, but he was then missioned there to help lead relief work with me. A Salvadoran Jesuit, again, of my age. Here we were like, mid-20s, working on this really basic level development issues. How do you rebuild communities? How do you rebuild farming? How do you give people a sense of certainty after all the uncertainty of flooding and all these things? And of course, we worked with older Jesuits as well. But for me, it was so transformative to find myself a part of another community, of one that was willing to dream and dream big and take risks in a way that, we often get a little bit hidebound sometimes in our own institutions. It's sort of like, okay, we've got this big structure, we've got all the rules, we know how we do it, this is the way you do things. And here was like, none of the structures are left. Nothing is functioning. How do we start to get that going again? And it's one of the few times I've had like I'm just like literally almost to blows arguments with Jesuits before about like ways that we could do this. But I've also never laughed as much with Jesuits, or in some cases cried as much. I mean, it was just this thing of like, let's take this on and work with people. And as I said to people when I had to come back to do my theology studies, and theology studies is a wonderful moment, but I said, I felt like I just went from making life or death decisions for people on a daily basis and working with them as they made life or death decisions with no time to reflect, to a space for theology studies in the bucolic spaces of Berkeley, where I had all the time in the world to reflect and not a decision that meant one whit about the world, So it is this.
Except that final decision to get ordained, right? But that was like
huge
one. It's only one, yeah, right.
But all that kind of set myself on fire again to be really working in development context, and it gave me a sense of how important it is to work with other Jesuits and how much I love that.
That's cool. Along that same vein, can you describe what a Jesuit community life is in some of your travels? You've obviously seen so many different Latin American countries, but also European countries, things like that. What's always the same, and what seems to be different about Jesuits as an international group?
Yeah, we're fortunate that we have a few structures that really hold us together. And when I say structures, even I would say the structure of our spirituality. Mm-hmm. So every Jesuit has made the spiritual exercises, has been transformed by this encounter with Jesus, where we've looked really seriously at ourselves, realized, as Ignatius says, how unworthy we are, but also how called we are, how much we need to kind of give ourselves over to this process with Jesus. And then kind of being, to use another Jesuit phrase from one of the general congregations, to have this sense of kind of holy boldness, this boldness to try things, to do things, to not be kind of hidebound. And so when you have that spirit, and then you have the structures of daily life. So, no matter where you go in the world, every Jesuit community, every person has their own room, and having a little bit of privacy is a good thing, having a little bit of space to yourself. Having a real commitment to hard work, but also gathering for Mass and meals just about every day. And it's, that varies. So in my community in Honduras, it meant that we had like a 7 a.m. Mass. I was recently in Colombia, it was like 6:30 in the morning, they had their Mass. Here at Wolfington, we have our Mass at 5:45 in the afternoon, and that's pretty common in a lot of active works here in the United States. And then always some meal. There's always a meal that's important. So in Honduras, we would be all out, but we'd all come together for lunch, because lunch is like the big meal there. And especially in Honduras, sometimes somebody bring a friend along. Well, we only had so much food, and just everybody look around the table. It was the old sort of thing of like, okay, well, there are 6 tortillas there, and there are 7 of us now. So either somebody's not taking a tortilla today, or we're going to divide up the tortillas, But there's a sense of hospitality around the shared table, and usually some lingering afterwards. So when I'm in Argentina, lunch is the big meal, and then afterwards you always go to have some coffee afterwards. Everybody sits in a big circle, and you have maybe 20 minutes, half an hour of conversation. Maybe even go take a little siesta after that, and then back to work. Here in Wolfington, it's really more in the evening. So we've got Mass, and we often have some social, some gathering. We have a little space over in the house where people gather with a drink or something, and then dinner and some time to really process the day. And I find those things, those structures, when I know I have a community I can tap into and let off my steam some, just kind of be together with and enjoy. Then I can go do a lot of the individual work, because a lot of Jesuit work is individual. It's out, me doing my writing or my teaching and somebody else doing their administrative work or their pastoral work. Those two kind of have this sort of rhythm that we move between that's really sustaining. And finally, just one last thing I want to highlight. I've been struck by the way, no matter where I've been in the world, the ways we see each other's needs and can see when each other are either excited by something, hurting, whatever. So, a number of years ago, I was in Argentina. I had been in that community a couple times before, but didn't know everybody super well. But in the middle of that time, my brother was in a car accident. And guys individually kind of would come over to me and say, like, how are you doing? And a couple of them said, why don't we take a walk? And I just remember like this sense of people noticing that I had a need and then taking the time out of their day to be with me and listen to me. Jesuits are often good listeners, and that's something I found really sustaining wherever I've been throughout my lifetime.
That's really nice. Yeah, I know that ritual of the coffee was when I was studying in France. It was the same thing, and so I wonder if there's a European connection to that kind of. We all go to another room, we all sit in a circle drinking our coffee, and then 10 minutes later we're done and we go back to work or something like that. Yeah.
No.
But those fun little rituals, so you get to kind of immerse yourself in their way of doing things. Well, that's really great. Maybe zero in a little bit about Central America a little bit. For the first time we have a Latin American Pope, right? Pope Francis. And in your work with the Center of Latin America and work with Latin American studies, how important do you think this is not only for the church but for the political and the economic situation in that region? Yeah, and do you obviously? I mean, I see his Jesuit training at work in his papacy, but maybe you have an insight too about how you see that. So it's kind of a broad question, but what do you think of the Pope as a Latin American, as an Argentinian?
Well, I think Pope Francis just brings such an important perspective, and it's a perspective that comes from living in societies where rich and poor don't live too awful far from each other, and there's some awareness of each other. Latin America has been really since at least the time of colonization, has been the most unequal region in the world. Doesn't mean the poorest region in the world. It means the biggest divide between those who have a lot and those who have very little. And Pope Francis was immersed in that from his childhood. He came from sort of a working class background, not the poorest of the poor, but working class, but knew what the struggle was like to make ends meet. And that gave him a tremendous respect for the poor, and especially for the ways that those with less material means can be creative and innovative, and can care for one another, can show solidarity to one another. He's elevated those values in a particular way. Maybe if many popes before, and I don't want to speak in generalizing, but many have come from wealthier or more educated classes. In some ways, Pope Francis, though he's very well educated, is someone that has more of his feet on the ground in pastoral situations. They often say that his theology is the teología del pueblo, of the people, of the masses in a sense. And that's because he's very connected to them. And he's been able to elevate at this time in human history the important need for us to integrate into all our planning those who have been left behind. He sees inequality, he calls it out in clear terms, and he's linked our economic efforts to our environmental efforts, to the ways we care for what he calls the common home, this shared creation that we've been given by God, and we have the opportunity to nurture and to see grow. How do we do that in a way that values the needs of every person? And that's a very Latin American thing. And it's kind of the question, at least in my own life, that has motivated me for years. And it took me a long time to appreciate this. But if you're going to say, what was the genesis of my intellectual formation? It was a time when I was in high school, working in Paraguay, right near the Brazilian border. And I was within, 10 kilometers of the border. And they had just finished Itaipu Dam. At the time, it was the world's largest hydroelectric dam. Okay? Wow. Had 12 turbines, could power a huge portion of Brazil, and it had enough that it could have powered all of Paraguay. Okay, each country got 6 turbines worth of electricity. Paraguay sold 5.5 of its turbines of electricity to Brazil, and the town where I was, so I could I could stand on this hill, I could see the lights of Itaipu Dam out there, but we had no electricity in the town where I was. And I remember at the time saying, this doesn't just happen by chance. I mean, I could have run the wire. Like if you gave me enough wire, I could have run the wire from there to the town where I was. And I remember thinking, this is a choice. This is a political choice, not necessarily made maliciously, but made some that's left us with this situation. And I think Pope Francis, that's the kind of thing he sees, where he says, you know what, there are human choices that have led to the degradation of so much of the Amazon, that have led to so many people being treated like trash, or left to have no other opportunity other than to be a trash collector. These are things that to him are part of his daily vision that he's elevated for us in a powerful way that a Latin American particularly can understand and name.
Yeah, wow. We also, of course, have Father General Arturo Sosa, another Latin American, who's guiding us as our general in the Society of Jesus. You've had some interaction with him. What do you think he brings to the table in terms of our international work as Jesuits? Not saying that we didn't do it before him, it's always been part of us, but does he bring a certain kind of perspective or flavor to it?
One thing I think that Father General Sosa brings is a desire to especially capitalize on our universities. He recently asked the universities of Latin America, and Georgetown along with them, since we have such good Latin America programs, to look at the quality of democracy in the region in Latin America, because democracy is challenging around the world. We had this naive notion after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the ends of the dictatorships in Latin America that democracy is going to be easy. Like once you start to unleash it, just everybody is going to take this on. And it's going to be it's just going to flow and flourish. And we've actually seen lots of pushback. Leaders that are often eager to stay in power themselves, or to have more powers for themselves, or to protect certain interests over others. And Latin America struggled with this quite a bit. And so he's asked us to look really carefully at the quality of democracy and trace out some of its evolution, and do that with the sort of the framework and understanding of justice that we as Jesuits bring and our Jesuit works bring. And it strikes me that we have an opportunity to make a contribution that few other people could, because we actually have feet on the ground in every one of our Jesuit universities, and actually almost all of them are connected to social ministries and parishes in every country in the world. So there's a way when, the UN goes to write a report, well, they call in scholars from a few different places. Well, we actually have people on the ground working at every level of society. And so I think Father General Sosa kind of sees this as an opportunity. Let's capitalize on what we have here to better address issues around democracy, and especially then to connect those to some of the preferences of the Society of Jesus, right? So this idea of trying to search out a way to have a hope-filled future, especially for youth, which democracy clearly plays a role in, or to better care for our environment, which is one of the really important values, of the Society of Jesus. So I think he's bringing a groundedness, but also an intellectual side to that to try to address these issues.
Yeah, he's really capitalizing on this kind of globalization and networking. In some ways, we always knew we were a global reality, and we experienced our lives as Jesuits in a global way. But I think over the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a sense of how do we use these networks to articulate more deeply, to maybe work together in a more clearer way. And I know you've been kind of on the front lines of some of that as we've been trying to, as a Society of Jesus, have been trying to respond to global initiatives, organizing roundtables and seminars and strategies. You've really kind of represented Georgetown as much as the society there in a lot of projects in Rome. Can you tell us a little bit about your work on some of these global concerns? I know the intellectual apostolate, and I'm certainly most familiar with the justice and the global context, that global economy one. So you kind of have been part of this group of Jesuits who have been like major thought leaders in some ways for the Society of Jesus, networking these ideas.
It was a special privilege to be a part of these, groups because as I, think back to what first attracted me to the Jesuits, it was being in community and working on important issues. And when I first got this email from Father General, it was actually the previous Father General, Adolfo Nicolas, inviting me to Rome for this meeting, I actually thought it was spam. I was like, who writes an email from Father General, but once there, I was so struck by what it's like to be with Jesuits from around the world. So, the intellectual apostolate, so we were invited to go and help Father General think about the importance of intellectual work inside what Jesuits do around the globe. As we've gotten more and more into social ministries, as we've kept up our pastoral ministries and emphasis on the exercises, what role should intellectual life, intellectual leadership in some ways play in the society? And that was 3 full days, morning to night, with Father General Nicolas, and then this group of 7 other relatively young scholars. So all of us were under 50. And we had, a scholar from Burkina Faso, one from Indonesia, one from Spain, one from Mexico, myself, one from Sri Lanka. So it was this really interesting, group. Wow. And we really talked about, so what does this look like in each of our contexts? Because each of us were in very different institutions. What does this look like? What do systems like, tenure mean? Should they mean something to Jesuits? All these sorts of questions. So I love the diversity of it, and I loved hearing the experience of other Jesuits as they kind of made their way there. But then the other one that you alluded to, which has probably had more of an impact, because the intellectual one was really kind of for the society inward, like looking at what it should do and values its own values. The other was trying to think more outwardly. What does justice in the global economy look like? And trying to think about, as we're in this phase of human history, as we say in that document, because we then eventually produced a document which could be circulated to Jesuits and really more broadly. And so it's been published. The only thing I've had published that's like in like 7 different languages or something. So it's, it's gotten out there in a number of ways. But one thing we say there was, we live in a period in human history when we have never seen an equal number of people exit poverty. So actually see growth in their lives, see better opportunities in their lives. It doesn't mean they're ultra secure. It doesn't mean they're all in middle class living standards, but it means they're like struggling to make sure they have a meal today, has really diminished. There's a lot more people that have more opportunities. And parenthetically, let me just say that the COVID pandemic is complicating that a lot, because we've seen a lot of people fall back into poverty, and we signal in that article the vulnerability of the growth that was there. But at the same time, even as there was this growth, there's also been this division, which I've already alluded to, between rich and poor, with the rich getting much, much richer than the poor who are getting slightly better off. And in some ways, should this be a problem? Well, it might not be, absolutely, but we do see concentrations of power in fewer and fewer hands. And that raises real questions about, the ability for everyone to meaningfully participate, to have meaningful democracy. And so we try to raise some of these questions, elevate them in a way that then can call us to really what we eventually say a process of reconciliation. So we're using a religious term to talk about a political and economic reality, and saying, how do we get to that point where we actually see eye to eye again? Where, instead of being people, one who's looking over the other or can't see the other, how do we actually see eye to eye again? Which, literally reconciliation, if you tear it apart, in terms of its constant, it basically means to see eye to eye, to almost bat eyelashes at each other. And so we ask ourselves, how do we do that? And then sort of a subsequent piece to that work, I wrote something about probably the necessary step of asking for forgiveness as part of that reconciliation.
Yeah.
And we really haven't talked enough about that, probably globally, about how do those who have so much, and in fact have used so much of the Earth's resources, and I include myself in that, being in a rich country like this and in a rich city like Washington, how do we ask for forgiveness for those who have not had the same access to the opportunities and the resources we have? And how do we not get just stuck there in sort of a sense of, mea culpa and hitting myself, but how do we get to a point where we say, how can we actually be committed to working together to forging something where we all can be
well, I think what you're talking about too, Matt, is something that it comes up also in Pope Francis, but it comes up with even in the Society of Jesus' own other documents about, we've used the word faith and justice a lot, but the word reconciliation, as you say, we've not used. And in many ways, we keep on having to go to the same, we end up going to legal categories of justice, not because we think that's right, but it's just, that's how it gets played out in political structures and discourse. But the word reconciliation, it puts a pause, doesn't it? And says, oh, it's not just that you should get something. I want to know you, and you deserve this, and we need to be, as you say, eye to eye in the struggles of a common kind of humanity. It's a different kind of, it really is different. I think that's really a positive new thing in the Society of Jesus, is this real quest, whether it's Sosa, Pope Francis, the general congregations, your work with this global economy, global economics. It's about reconciliation as a key component if we really do want to transform anything in the world.
Yeah, and if I can just mention, it's all those things, and it's also President DeGioia and Georgetown in our working group on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. I had the privilege of being part of that original working group, which was at best the first few steps of a 1,000-step or 10,000-step process.
Yeah.
And one of the things we learned in that is who should be the protagonists here, right? And so again, when you're using legal structures, well, those that have more need to be sort of forced to give to. No, actually, this is saying we need to see all as potential protagonists, and we need to actually hear voices that haven't been heard. Right. And that means we will probably be challenged in ways that we didn't expect to be challenged, and might even be, find ourselves really ashamed or really have to admit our own, wrongdoing. And then to be really committed to working together and listening and forging common futures. And that, I think, when President DeGioia named the working group that, because that was not something we came up with, it changed the tenor of everything. To say that what we're talking about here is memory, but reconciliation. It's a process that goes on that can't just be decreed, but actually has to be worked through and ultimately forged together.
Yeah, a real sense of accompaniment with each other. You brought it back to Georgetown by mentioning that and the great work there. And so I want to bring it back to the Center for Latin American Studies. Is that the name? Do I have the name right?
That's great.
Yeah. So tell us what's happening there and some of your hopes and dreams. I mean, this has really been something almost like you're kind of a player in this development of this center.
Yeah, so what's really fun about it is, so our Center for Latin American Studies was founded in 1959, so right after the Cuban Revolution. A number of other centers for Latin American Studies founded around that time, engaged in graduate education, engaged in research, working with local agencies and outreach to local agencies, convening roundtables and all these sorts of things. So an intellectual think tank, in a sense, inside the university to engage topics around Latin America. And we continue to be one of the really strongest in the country. I've now been serving as director just for 4 years now, and I really came in on the shoulders of incredible predecessors. But one thing about Georgetown, and you know this about any big organization, is we often proliferate efforts in different parts of the university, and we don't necessarily know what each other is doing. And here, we have all these great schools. So our business school has a fantastic program, the Latin American Leadership Program. Our law center has the Center for the Advancement of the Rule of Law in the Americas. The public policy school has been developing a lot on Latin America. And so we've been crafting over the last few years, and which will really be coming to fruition in the coming months, is a umbrella for all of Georgetown with Latin America that draws together our strengths from all the different parts of the university. And so to work with my colleagues across the university is really exciting. It's gone from being from doing one thing I think very, very well, which is our graduate programs, our undergraduate programs, to thinking even bigger about what impact can we have in the region. How can we start to have a Georgetown presence in the region? Because right now, many of us go and give talks and interact and do research and all these sort of things. We're fortunate students that come from the region. But what would this look like when we're a convener both here in DC and in Buenos Aires, or a convener in Rio, or in Santiago de Chile, or wherever? So this, I think, has poised us at this really exciting moment. And we're really grateful. We have a number of alumni that have become very big supporters of this. So Georgetown is rolling this out over the coming months, and you'll hear a lot more about it in the coming months.
That's great. Well, congratulations for all the hard work and all and that. Being part of SFS, it's founded 100 years ago by Father Edmund Walsh, and as we all know, it's really there to kind of address the issues after World War I, and really kind of becoming an important player, you might say, in policy and in service. So now we're in its second century, and you've been around now 11 years. What opportunities do you think the SFS has to offer students today who have these international interests like you do to face issues in the world?
So, I think SFS is probably more necessary than ever. The idea was, how do we forge people? Actually, it was interesting. In its initial formulation, it was almost called, and you probably heard this, the School of Foreign Trade, because it was about rebuilding commerce. One of the first classes was warfarery management. How do you bring the ships into port, so you can get this stuff done. But it always had this idea of service as well, especially diplomacy. And a large number of its graduates went into the foreign service of the United States or the diplomatic corps of their home countries. And that's been tremendously influential. And to this day, I'm told by people, in state, that half their department will be Georgetown grads. It's just, everybody you run into is a Georgetown grad. And I really hope that that's something we'll continue to do. But one thing we've seen recently in recent years, too, is the important role played by the private sector in economic development, in establishing political ties, in building up relationship, meaningful social relationships. And the internet, of course, has democratized that. There's more opportunities for people to have communications.
Right.
And so that's actually one area where I see our students being really well poised, because they know how to use some of these technologies, but they have a sense of how diplomacy works, how commerce works, and they can think about how do we bring the private and public sectors together in some ways. And maybe especially if sometimes those are opposed to each other, at least, where you'll talk about, whether it's, sort of, state-led or private-led or something. I think in this pandemic, whatever we come out with is going to have to be able to combine efforts. One thing we've seen is that the private sector cannot do it all at this moment, because we've seen how devastating it's been for the private sector. Likewise, government can't do it all. Government can play some important backstop roles, but can't do it all. So how do we see these really creatively working together? And I think Georgetown students are prepared both from our coursework, from their internships here in DC, to really make a difference. And I always love, the one thing I'll say about teaching students here is helping them break free of the shackles of, oh, it needed to be this way or this way, when in fact, often the job that's best for them is this way, right? It's something that like nobody has seen yet, but they're charting out. And I think that they're ready for that. So I think now more than ever, SFS is ready to do that in a cross-cultural, cross-national way.
Yeah.
And let me just say one last thing on that, just that SFS has always really encouraged knowledge of languages and experiences in other cultures. Those two things are actually something that open doors. They've opened more doors in my life than anything else. So to be able to speak Spanish has just opened me to a wealth of experiences that I could not have known about or understood otherwise. And then to be able to operate cross-culturally, there is so much richness to that. Whether it's understanding a reference that somebody makes or hearing something that only can be formulated in that language. Or as you and I like to talk about, foods that you get to taste in different places. There are just these delights to that, this human contact that comes alive there. And SFS trains in that. So for all the things that have changed in the SFS, the commitment to languages and to international experiences has only gotten stronger.
That's great. No, it's a wonderful, wonderful school, and what a great celebration we had in the fall and in the early part of this semester, but having to kind of put it on hold a little bit during Corona. But okay, before we go to some of the questions that are coming in from alumni and Hoyas today, I wanted to say, if you had 3 books that you would recommend that were, you know, kind of transformative, that in your wheelhouse of what you do, they don't have to all be fiction or nonfiction, but if you could name, what would those 3 be? So if somebody was going to read this summer, what would you say? Oh, this book really was important to me, and things like that.
Okay, so I'm going to give you two fiction and 1 nonfiction.
There you go.
Okay, so let's start with the nonfiction, because it's something I've been talking about a bit. So thinking about the growth of economic opportunities, but also the growing inequality. Thomas Piketty's book, which is now probably 5 years old,
Right.
but it's hefty, but it's history. It's not so much like tough equations. He does have 1 equation in there. He probably shouldn't have put in the book. But anyway, the history of it is so marvelously told. He tells it he uses literature to tell parts of it, and I think it really does give a perspective on the moment in which we're living and how these long-term trends have been going. It's really fabulous. And then 2 others, thinking about literature from Latin America. So one is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Cien Años de Soledad, so 100 Years of Solitude.
Oh my God!
Which is, you know, the
books. Yes, absolutely.
It's kind of the urtext of, and it's the one that I think just gets you into this much of the mindset of a region. So much so that I remember I was with a Jesuit and lost in the middle of Guatemala one day. He asked me, "Do you know where we are?" And I said, "Well, I'm not really sure." And he goes, "Macondo," which is the mythical, you know, location in 100 Years of Solitude. So, and that one, if you want to lose yourself this summer, you know, in something that would be really nice and kind of and ultimately, you know, affirming in its own way, yeah. And it gives you a sense of the duration of time, right, which we're feeling so acutely now.
Right.
That would be one. And then bigger, at the other end of Latin American fiction, actually the book I'm reading right now. So Roberto Bolaño is a Chilean author, died very young. I think he was 51 years old, died around 2005 or so, 4 or 5, if I remember right. And this is supposedly his masterwork. It's called 2666. It's a number that no one has actually figured out why he called the book that. He has, in some other small short story, he mentions a number that's kind of like that. But it's kind of a literary mystery novel. So you have these critics going around looking for this sort of mythical author. It also actually touches into the violence at the US-Mexico border and does sort of an investigation of that. You know, again, it's a thick tome. I think it's 1,000 pages in Spanish. But it's told in this just masterful, beautiful, so I'm reading it in Spanish. And the Spanish is magical. It's got good English translations out there. But
you said it doesn't have an English translation out yet?
Yeah, so and a very good English translation came out a few years ago. His other, you could also read Savage Detectives, which is an earlier book of his that's equally, just magisterial. And what I love about these is they get you into, all 3 of these books actually in some sense have a bit of a global mindset, but have some rootedness in reality or a local, you know, feature or factor, one that really touches people's lives. And they help you think about bigger things. And I think actually now in the pandemic, thinking about bigger things is important. And asking those deep questions. So yeah, I'd highly recommend them.
That's great. That's great. Well, this has been really a lot of fun, and we have some questions I think coming in from some of the viewers. And should we go to those perhaps now?
Sure.
Kelly?
Sounds great. So first question, Father Carnes, thank you for sharing your experience. What are some of the biggest challenges in Latin America from a political perspective post-coronavirus? If you could also expand on this, what have you heard about the Jesuit communities you've worked with in the region and how they are faring?
Yeah, so the region is a great question. The region is experiencing different challenges throughout the region. So it's really diverse, the kinds of responses we've seen. Some countries have been very hard hit, some have been less hard hit. We're seeing both the shortcomings of investment in social services, so whether that's healthcare, an ability to respond. So Ecuador, a few weeks ago, there was a lot of talk about they didn't even have the capacity to pick up the bodies of those who had passed away. And so, this the really tremendous social services challenge. Another, though, politically is really preserving democratic governance and making sure that voices can be heard from across the political spectrum. Some governments have been highly resistant to talking about the coronavirus. Some have almost denied it altogether. Some have kind of hidden it. So whether you're thinking about like a Bolsonaro in Brazil, who's sort of dismissed it, Ortega and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, who's tried to sort of say, well, let's just go on with life as normal. Mexico, Lopez Obrador has tried to, kind of not pay that much attention to it, even though it seems like it's really affecting people a great deal. So I would say the challenge of reconsolidating trust in democratic governance is going to be very important. Happily, I've seen Jesuits working hard at this and really trying to contribute in their own settings. So a good friend of mine in Argentina, actually someone who did a semester with us at Georgetown, Rodrigo Sarasaga, a few years ago, he's now back in Argentina, and he's been working closely with the government, although he was very close to the previous government, which was a very different political stripe. He's now working with the present government to organize food aid to those that are having to shelter in place, because there's the crisis of illness from the coronavirus, but there's also the crisis of not having enough food. And if you can't go out, and especially people that normally buy on a daily basis in markets, that's something that's really been lacking. So he's been organizing, along with other churches, services to go out into these very poor areas to provide food and care for people. I know Jesuits in a number of other countries have been working closely with the governments and with other actors to try to build sort of spaces in which people can talk and bring forth their needs in a way that will start to rebuild a lot of the structures that we'll need. So it's a very fluid moment. As you probably know, Latin America is now getting into its worst part of the crisis. So if if China had it first, and then if Europe saw it second, and then the United States, now Latin America is the real, the place that's facing this the most, and with tremendous concern about what this will mean for the future.
Wow. I don't, perhaps they have nursing facilities like they do in Canada and the United States, but we lost a lot. We've lost some Jesuits to the COVID-19 here from 2 nursing facilities, one in Toronto, one in Philadelphia. And so it was quite a sad thing for us as a community to have 6 guys, have 5 guys die. Do you know about, do they have a different healthcare system for Jesuits who are elderly in any of those places that you visit?
So I've been to some of the infirmaries. I haven't heard any news out of them that leads me to believe that people have become ill. So there's one in Lima, Peru, that actually is really, they take very good care of the guys there. So I would imagine they're using protocols similar to what we have in the United States. Argentina as well. So I haven't really heard of any number of deaths in any place. I don't doubt that probably some have occurred, but to my knowledge, as of yet, I haven't heard.
Okay, cool, thanks. Okay, Kelly, the next question.
Sure. So you touched a bit on Pope Francis. How hard do you think it must be for him to balance his deeply rooted mission to work closely with and for the poor, and with his work at the Vatican and facing at times resistance from, quote unquote, the establishment, or as we hear in reporting?
Yeah. No, I think it's been a real struggle for him to try to figure out how to work. And this is true actually for a lot of us when we enter a new organization, trying to figure out like who pulls the strings where and how do you make this happen. And we always think of a pope as having sort of absolute power, but we know that it's a really human institution. So a lot of it is built up with, if I ask you to do something, even if I have the right to order you to do that, you may not do it. So he's had to build up those human relationships, and in some cases, move people along. So some people, as they retire, then can move on. Some people you can bring in new, and he's had to do that, I think, quite carefully. My sense is he relies a lot on personal relationship, as many of us do, right? So he tries to develop a personal relationship with people he can trust, and has created, initially created that group of 8, cardinals who he could look at, and they were very diverse from around the world. And he's tried to pay attention to them in particular so he can understand what's going on the ground. Likewise, if you look at his appointment of bishops, he's appointed bishops not in the biggest cities, but often in smaller cities or places that are, less well known, particularly because he thinks they will represent to him and bring to him voices that he wouldn't otherwise hear. I think of Pedro Barreto. So Pedro Barreto is a Jesuit who became bishop of a place called Huancayo, which is kind of in the mountains of Peru. Huancayo had never, ever, ever had a cardinal, but Pope Francis made him a cardinal because he saw this as someone he could trust, someone who would bring the interests of the indigenous people that are there in this sort of highlands of Peru to the Vatican so that he could actually hear their voices. And I think this is tremendously important. Actually, I think there's a lesson for all of us when we think about how do we try to lead. What ways do I have to hear the voices of those throughout my organization? Because often I hear those people who have jobs similar to mine or work in the same floor or the same level of my organization. And Pope Francis has very conscientiously said, how can I find people that are off the map and bring them into this space? And that's, I think, has been really transformative, but not easy. And I'm sure he's encountered a lot of pushback as people who thought they were in the place that should get that title didn't get it.
And he's also somebody who will kind of plow through bureaucracy. I mean, when he wanted to go make his first trip to Lampedusa to visit migrants, the story is told that he kept on saying, I want to go here, and hit all the bishops around him said, well, no, we can't do it. So he got his own cell phone and he called up Alitalia and said, let's do this. And they said, who is this? And so it was kind of like, oh my God, this is Pope Francis. That we know that, when he wants to do something, he will do it. And if he has to plow a little bit, he will plow through. So that's been really refreshing as well, to see that he wants to play by the rules of the manners of the Vatican and the manners of this ancient 2,000-year tradition, but he's not afraid to kind of push himself into new areas or push them into new areas.
Right.
Yeah. Very good. Kelly, maybe we have time for at least one more, I think.
Perfect. Thank you both. I should note too that we have gotten several requests for confirmation of the authors and titles of your book recommendations. So we will surely include those details in our follow-up email. So our last question from our audience. Funny, isn't it, how both you, Father Carnes, and Father Hentz had referenced sitting at a table sharing meals within the Jesuit community as crucial. Can you talk a bit about how it has been being physically distanced from your students for the better part of this semester, and what you're hearing from them?
I know how challenging it's been. I mean, I know that I've heard from my students that they've enjoyed being with their family for the most part. There's a certain point when that can be a little much. We Jesuits, we're lucky we have our own room, so we can get away a tiny bit. But I know it's been challenging. And I mentioned I had that bridge course, which is this senior course, kind of, you're reflecting a bit on your time at Georgetown. And we were technically supposed to stop at the midterm, because that's when we normally stop. They asked if we could continue. And so we actually kept meeting over Zoom every single week at our normal time. And everybody showed up every week because to them it was so important to stay connected. And I've heard now from my students about ways where they've, set up everything from virtual happy hours to virtual game nights to watching movies together, that they'll all watch, from the same place and be chatting along the way, or talking afterwards. That connection is so really important. And I've been touched because I've had a few groups reach out to me and say, hey, could we do this? Could we get together with you, or would you join our group? So even actually tonight, believe it or not, the group that graduated 1 year ago, so that wrote their theses in Latin American studies, who I worked with very, very closely. I'm going to get together with them and we'll be kind of catching up on how our lives are going. It's not the same as being in the same room. I remember with that same group a year ago when they had finished, we all went to Tombs and could have an experience together, Now it's over Zoom. But, Georgetown students, human beings, but Georgetown students in particular, were built for connection. There's this connection where we want to linger and to share and to be together, and without that, it's a lot tougher. And so, much like Father Hentz, I found I value all the more during this time the dinners and the meals I have with Jesuits in the Jesuit community. I look forward to it every day as a chance to be together, and I know my students are finding ways to keep that going, however they can in this setting. in a really, and I've been impressed by how responsible they've been about social distancing, because there have been temptations for those who are in the area to not do that, but I know they've been pretty good on that as well.
That's great. Well, this has really been wonderful, Matt. I mean, I feel like I've known you for quite a long time, but it's just nice to kind of have it all distilled in a conversation over an hour. Just the breadth of your work, your dedication to Georgetown, to our students, and really a kind of creating an alumni base of people who have now gone through Latin American studies, who've known you, and who are there to support your work and the work of Georgetown. So I really want to thank you so much. This has been really good. Of course, we'll see you at dinner, so we'll be switching places here. But I really appreciate it, and we'll get the names of those books, 100 Years of Solitude, the other Picardy's book, and I'm not sure what the third one was. I forgot again.
Yeah,
so
yeah, we'll write it out so people can see it.
Sounds good. Sounds good. And I really want to thank all of you for joining us today. We're going to do another conversation with another Jesuit, Father Greg Shendon, in 2 weeks. So not this coming Tuesday, but the following Tuesday. Father Greg Shendon is our director of campus ministry here, well beloved by students, known from retreats, from Dahlgren Chapel, for his love of poetry, his love of music. And so we're going to talk a little bit about putting together his life, his love of poetry, and maybe do a bit of a poetry jam as part of our conversation. So please join us here in a couple weeks. And in the meantime, have a very safe and time right now. Stay well and continue your social distancing.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thanks. Thanks so much, Matt.
Thank you.